Hello, hello, hello. Testing, testing, testing. Hopefully we are live. Sounds of it. Testing. Yes, we are. Okay. Welcome to the Yours Truly Baphomet podcast, everyone. Today we are going into the 9th trip of the High Priest by Dr. Timothy Leary. And today it looks like he's looking at liberating the imprisoned with the sacrament. So that's interesting. You know, it's been so fun reading this book. But like, I almost want to at the same time get through this because I've noticed that a lot of people aren't really watching it. I hope people come around and watch it eventually, but at the same time, I actually do want to get to making other videos and other content besides this one. So I would say that at least I'll at least try and finish this book first before producing any other content, because I personally want to get to the end of it because it's been an incredible book so far. And also I want to start generating subscribers because I'm sitting at 19 currently, and it'd be nice to actually start getting people in. So let's begin. So the sacrament and the liberated. Joyous lake, the clinging fire. Fire in the lake, the image of revolution. Okay. Let's just get a piece of paper here. Fucking books everywhere on my desk, guys. You can't actually see that. It's just a bit chaotic at the moment because I've been like a weird old man, an old hermit. I am Virgo though, so I guess that does make me the hermit. And nonetheless, I look like a weird old hermit at the moment with the way you'll see books all around the fucking house and that kind of thing. Anyway, let's begin with this one. So, fire in the lake, the image of revolution. Thus, the superior man sets the calendar in order and makes the season clear. So, what that's saying is basically understand the seasons, understand the cycles, and you can most certainly understand where everything's going. And that's sort of what planets are like, in a way. If you understand how the seasons change in your own microcosm and what tends to happen in your own microcosm based on the precession of all the zodiacs, you can actually, in a way, divinate your future by the stars. And I think that requires you to sort of just keep a log of things that happen during certain sextiles or trines and things like that, or any particular positions of the stars that are important. I think always keeping in mind Mercury as one of the planets tends to be really important because it's actually the planet of communication, messaging, knowledge. I think it's the most important one of all for everyone. And then the moon, and then the sun. Yeah. All right. Without further ado, let's continue though. During the fall and the winter of 1960, much of my time and energy was going into the study of the effects of psychedelic mushrooms. I was also carrying on an active program of lecturing, teaching, and field work in clinical psychology in the Harvard Graduate School. I had been brought to Harvard in 1959 in order to introduce existential transactional methods for behavior change. After 15 years of practicing psychotherapy and about 10 years of doing research on psychotherapy, I come to the conclusion that there was very little that one person called a doctor could do for another person called a patient by talking to him across a desk or listening to him as he lay on a couch. I developed a lot of theories and a lot of methods on how behavior change could be brought about more effectively than the standard clinical interview method. There are two main points to the theories I developed. First, transactional. I was convinced that the doctor had to suspend his role and status as a doctor, had to join the other person actively and collaboratively in figuring out the solution to his problem. As much as possible, the doctor had to turn over the responsibility to the man who knew most about the problem at hand, namely the patient. I developed many techniques for getting our patients to help each other. So, okay. The second point in my theory, existential, was that the doctor had to leave the safety of his consulting room and get out there in the field where the so-called patient is having his unique problems and where he is going to solve his problems. I saw the role of the doctor as that of a coach in a game in which the patient was the star player. The coach can help, can point out mistakes, can share his wisdom, but in the last analysis, the guy who does job is the guy out there in the field, the so-called patient. I was enthusiastic about these theories because they worked and because no joy in teaching can equal that thrill which comes when you watch someone who's been hung up and blocked and confused and making a mess of things out there in the field suddenly learn how. All this started happening before I got involved in the drug research, and I had already become a controversial figure around the Boston area because everything that I was saying had made a tremendous amount of sense to students and patients, but the doctors, the psychologists, the social workers, the professors, the psychologists were not so quick to accept these theories. I was asking them to give up their status and the omniscience position which they felt their training entitled them to. I asked them to turn over the authority and the star role in the game to the patient. You know, that's, yeah, so the whole thing of ego can really cloud the waters, right? With certain things. And this kind of thing can happen in science, but it probably does happen a lot more in things like medicine and psychiatry and things like that, because when people get that little star of approval for completing that course, they believe to be the authority and that no one can challenge them. And that's sort of how it goes, since we're like children, you know? Having this idea in our head that because we learned that no one should be able to challenge us, or because we got the approval of authority, in a sense, like the people in academia and like the board and the TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, become the church and the high priests and cardinals and bishops. It's no different, guys. You just gotta realize it's just under the veil of science and and we know better. All authority should be challenged, religious, material, medicinal, or otherwise. Anyway, this is another thing for the I Ching. Times change, and with them, their demands. Thus, the season change in the course of the year. In the world cycle, also, there are spring and autumn in the life of people and nations, and these call for social transformations. Yep, things got to change, people, if we want to really change the way things happen to us. And advance our thinking. We got to think a little bit outside the parameters, generally speaking. I was taking one day off a week to drive down with 2 or 3 graduate students to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where we were working in an orphanage, teaching social workers and nuns to set up groups in which older kids would help younger kids, in which children at every age level were encouraged to take more responsibility for running the school and planning their lives. We set up another project in a slum housing district in a Boston suburb. Here were hundreds of people who were bogged down socially and psychologically. They could not afford psychiatric help, and there was none available for them. With another group of graduate students, I used to go down there one night a week with tape recorders and blackboards. We set up a headquarters in one of the slum apartments and started teaching groups of the neighbors how they could help each other and become psychiatrists for each other and develop some facility for solving their own problems. Isn't that fantastic, guys? Instead of, like, the best psychologists are probably like people you trust, to be honest. In fact, I think if you've actually got good friends, they're better than a psychologist. So that's how I see it. It's been that way for me anyway. All of this, of course, was very to class at Harvard. Universities are supposed to be research institutes, and if you get too involved in service functions or helping people, you're considered a bleeding heart. Oh, dear. I was able to justify the work in the orphanage, the work with alcoholics, the work in slum projects by using the word methodology. We weren't really trying to help these people. No, sir, not us. We were trying to develop new techniques and scientific methods for changing psychotherapeutic theory. Of course, if people enjoyed it and got help, that was an interesting byproduct which supported the method and the theory. It was all experimental, you see. It became a tradition in the center where I worked that anytime they got call from a do-good social service agency requesting Harvard's help in curing any sort of social disease, the request was likely to get bucked to me because they knew that this was my vice and my eccentricity. There you go. One day I got a note in my box saying 2 men from the Department of Legal Medicine were interested in enlisting Harvard's help in the psychological rehabilitation of prisoners. Now, prison work is considered to be the least interesting, lowest status work you can do in the field of psychology, psychiatry, and sociology. The problems are hopeless. Criminals never change, the atmosphere is dreary, and the academic rewards are slim. But when I found this little piece of paper in my box requesting an appointment from 2 officials from the Department of Legal Medicine, I chuckled all the way to my office because this was just the chance I was looking for. By this time, we had given the psychedelic mushrooms to about 100 people in a wide variety of circumstances, and we had learned a lot about the process. In spite of the bungling and the confusion and our ignorance, we still hadn't caused any damage to anyone, and there were a lot of mistakes that we'd never make again. There you go. By this time, we had learned a few things about how to run the sessions. About 90% of the people who were taking the magic mushrooms were reporting the most ecstatic and educational experiences of their lives. Isn't that incredible, guys? Of their lives. The problem was there was no way to get any measurement as to how much good we were doing. There was no way to keep score. This, of course, is the main problem in the field of psychotherapy. You can develop a completely effective method of treating people's psychological problems, but there is no way you can prove it. You can work with 1,000 people and help every one of them change his way of thinking and his way of acting, but there are no statistics like hits, runs, and errors with which to tabulate your score. Yeah, that's always the big problem with psychology. You never really know if you've actually helped them or not, or made them worse even. But yeah, there's always a way to do it, I guess. The problem is that half the people you help are going to get better jobs and half of them are going to quit the jobs they have. Half of them may increase the intimacy and closely meaning in their marriages, but the other half may leave their wives. Changing a person's psyche is one thing, but measuring results in an observable way is another thing, because who's to say which behavior reflects growth and change? Yeah, there you go. That's a really important thing, guys, because change is the nature of the universe, and sometimes growth and change for people would be getting better work, picking up a hobby, getting a partner, or improving their relationships. Some of it may involve quitting a job, moving state, destruction of friendships, and all other kinds of destructive work. And that is terrifying. And usually the latter is the hardest one to do. Because for me, that was basically all of my psychological work. It was sifting through all of those kinds of people who I just really shouldn't have had in my life, and all kinds of habits and a job I shouldn't have. It was like that for a very, very long time. And it was exhausting, but I've come through it for the most part. I still have lots of work to do though. So you never stop. Doesn't matter how far you get, by the way, you never stop. Here's where the prison came in. The prison is the ideal place to do a study in psychotherapy behavior change, because when you try to rehabilitate prisoners, you've got an ironclad statistic you can work against. It's called the recidivism rate, where you are working with people outside. They may quit their job and join the Peace Corps, or they may quit their job and join the ministry, or they may quit the ministry and take up guitar, and you know about the growth of the person, but who else will believe it? But when you work with prisoners and you think you've helped them change, grow, and become more effective, there's an easy way to tell. Where are they a year after you finish with them? Are they back in jail, or are they making it on the outside? Prisoner rehabilitation offers the most objective check for someone who claims he can bring about change in behavior. In the prison of Massachusetts, the recidivism rate is about 70%. 7 out of every 10 men who leave prison return. That's sad, man. If you develop a new and surefire way to change a man's mind, the prison presents the toughest and cleanest test of your effectiveness. Can you keep him out of jail? That's why I wanted to get into the prison. Yeah, so there's at least one way to do that is like, can you keep him out of prison? Because if you can keep, this stuff truly works, you should be able to keep those people out of prison. So I'm actually really interested to see how that works for the most part. Now, the reason the prison psychologist wanted to get into Harvard is that everyone in an academic or professional activity in the Boston area had one way of measuring his success. Can he get on the Harvard payroll? The word Harvard in the Boston area is a powerful status symbol that operates at every level of society. There are several thousand janitors around the Boston area, but if you are a janitor at Harvard, you're a prince among custodians. The same with a cook, the same with a gardener, the same with a psychologist. A week later, I found myself sitting at a corner table in the Harvard faculty club with two officials from the Massachusetts prison system. What they wanted was simple. They wanted to have Harvard graduate students assigned to the prisons as psychology interns with a possible long-range hope of getting themselves clinical professorships at Harvard. And what I wanted was to get Harvard graduate students into the prisons because that's where I felt that all embryonic psychologists should be. Out in the field, dealing with the real people and real problems. But there was something else I wanted, and that was the chance to show that we could rehabilitate criminals by using the sacred mushrooms. And so the deal was made. I agreed to get Harvard approval to send graduate students to internships in the prison, and they agreed if I could get the approval of the warden and the prison psychiatrist, I could give psychedelic mushrooms to prisoners. About a week later, I drove out to the prison. I wore my Harvard tweed suit and my button-down shirt. The warden was impressed and pleased. It wasn't often that Harvard professors came out to the prison to do research. But the whole thing hinged on the approval of the psychiatrist because the sacred mushrooms were drugs. Oh no, people. The drugs. And to work with drugs, you had to have the medical okay. So we walked down to the hallway to the metal cage that let us into the prison. We opened up the first steel door and we stood in the anteroom. Then we rang a bell. A slot opened and a guard looked at us and opened up the second metal door. We walked into the middle of the guard room. Across the prison yard, the hospital where we rang the bell and got peered at through the slot. Heard the metal hinges creak and walked into the prison's hospital. We walked down the corridor to the psychiatrist's office and knocked on the door. After a minute, out walked one of the most entertaining and interesting men in American psychiatry. The first thing that struck me about the prison psychiatrist was that he was the best dressed man I'd ever seen. He was short, graceful, like a ballet dancer, the first Negro psychiatrist I'd ever met. I spent an hour talking with Dr. Madison Presnell. He was no intellectual. He mispronounced some of the polysyllabic words, but he had a twinkle in his eye and a wise, cool way of looking at you that told you he was a man who had seen a lot and suffered a lot and was still looking for the funniest and wisest part of everyone he came in contact with. In sizing up Dr. Presnell, I could say to myself a word I had heard used quite often in recent months. He was hip. It was obvious too that he had some experience with psychedelic drugs. Which ones? He didn't make clear. He could have had LSD in medical school or mescaline in psychiatric research or maybe pot in the village, but he knew what I was talking about. A few days later, Dr. Presnell came over to Harvard to meet some of my bosses, and the following Sunday he brought his beautiful and intelligent wife over to my house for cocktails. He sat down on a chair in my study, thought for a minute and said, "You plan to give psychedelic drugs to prisoners is the best idea I've heard from dealing with an impossible problem. If you're smart enough and dedicated enough to know how to do it, you could make it work. There's one chance in 100 you can pull it off, but if you do, you will have accomplished more for American society and for prisoner rehabilitation that has been done for the last 4,000 years since the Code of Hammurabi." But it's risky business. You're bound to run into trouble. As a matter of fact, the more successful you are, the more trouble you're going to stir up, because one thing I've learned, as a prison psychiatrist is that society doesn't want the prisoner rehabilitated. And as soon as you start changing prisoners so that they discover beauty and wisdom, God, you're going to stir up the biggest mess that Boston has seen since the Boston Tea Party. Oh no. I'll give you medical coverage and I'll be glad to serve as a psychiatric consultant, and I'll back you up all the way with the wardens, with the guards, with the mental health department. But sooner or later, as soon as they see the thing you do is working, they're going to come down on you, the news reporters, the bureaucrats, and the officials. Harvard give drugs to prisoners, and you're going to have to do the impossible. You're going to have to cure prisoners with your left hand, and that's something that's never been done before. And you're going to have to hold off the entire bureaucracy of the state of Massachusetts with your right hand, and that's never been done before, not even by Kennedy. So I'll back you all the way until you make a mistake, and when you make that mistake and they all start coming down at you, exactly at that point, I'm going to walk out because I'm not you. I'm not the new Frood, and I have no ambitions to play that game. I'm a Negro from the South with a degree from a second-class medical school, with a wife and 2 kids whom I'm trying to support and educate in an insane society. And I'll help you all the way to win, but I'm not going to lose with you. Damn, that's rough, man. Can you imagine that? Yeah. Political revolutions are extremely grave matters. They should be undertaken only under stress of direst necessity. When there is no other way out, not everyone is called to this task, but only the man who has the confidence of the people, and even he only when the time is ripe. He must then proceed in the right way so that he gladdens the people and by enlightening them prevents excesses. Furthermore, he must be quite fresh of selfish aims and must really relieve the need of the people. Only then does he have nothing to regret. There you have it, people. And so it was settled. Dr. Presnell would line up volunteers in the prisoner population for the Sacred Mushroom Project, and I would go back to Harvard and get graduate students who would volunteer their time and energy and their nervous systems to take drugs with maximum security prisoners at the penitentiary. Damn, fuck. A few days later, I was in my office when a knock came on the door, and I was visited by a graduate student named Ralph Metzner. Metzner had a reputation for being one of the smartest students in the department. He was a graduate of Oxford, an experimentalist, a precise, objective, and apparently very academic young man. He said he had heard about the prison project and he wanted to work with me on it. My first reaction was that Metzner was too academic, too dainty British, too bookish, too ivory-tailed to walk into a prison and roll up his sleeves and take drugs that will put him out of his mind with rough and tumble prisoners. Metzner said he wanted to learn how. Then I said, before you can give drugs and take drugs with anyone else, you have to have some experiences yourself. Are you ready to take mushrooms? He was ready. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what he wanted to do, to have a session. And so it happened that on March 12, 1961, at my home in Newton, Massachusetts, I ran a session for Dr. Presnell and his beautiful wife, for Ralph Metzner and his girlfriend, and another graduate student, Gunther Whale, and his wife, Karen. This was the 52nd time I had taken psilocybin with other people. The notes on the session say, this training session was designed to introduce several new subjects to the sacred mushroom experience under supportive circumstances. The session took place in my study. Since this was an exploratory training session, I took the participants that they should relax, have a good time, be entertained, and learn what they could. Dr. Presnell was the dominating factor in this session. His joking, warm attitude created a benign atmosphere. Each new subject had his spouse or a trusted friend present. After a long period of happy, relaxed giggling, the joking became more and more philosophic. Members of the group will leave the room periodically to be by themselves or to talk in pairs, but my study operated at the center of the session. There were no discordant notes, no anxiety, depression, or friction. We were finally getting to the point where we knew how to set up a pleasant session. Each member of this 6-person group reported a deep, ecstatic educational experience. Wonderful. Few days after this session, Ralph Metzner, Gunther Whale, and I drove out to the concrete prison and met with the 6 volunteers who had been selected by Dr. Presnell. We sat around a table in a dreary hospital room with grey walls, black asphalt wall, bars in the windows, telling 6 skeptical and suspicious men about an experience which could change their lives. The first psychedelic session in the prison was well planned. The first thing we did was to tell the prisoners as much as we could about the psychedelic experience. We brought in books for them to read, report by other subjects, articles which we described the terrors as well as the ecstasies of the experience. We spent most of the time describing our own experiences and answering groping questions. We made it very clear to the prisoners that this was nothing we were doing to them. There was no doctor-patient game going on here. We were to take the drugs along with them. We were doing nothing to them that we wouldn't willingly, happily have done to ourselves. Very important. So, like, you need to sort of be willing to do it yourselves. And I guess that's like the whole like instinct, right? It's like, oh, if everyone else is doing it, I better do it. Which unfortunately gets also used against us. Which kind of did in the pandemic. But yeah, that's sort of the thing. I think that's noble that they're taking it alongside them with them, which is really important, right? We also made a research contract with the prisoners. We said something like this: we want to find out how and how much you changed during this experience. For this reason, we want you to take a battery of psychological tests before you eat the mushrooms. Then after 3 or 4 sessions with the sacred mushrooms, we'll give you the tests again. The aim here is to find out how you change. Like you weigh yourself on a scale before and after you go on a diet. After you've taken the tests, we'll give you the results. We'll go over the tests with you and explain how you were before and how you've changed. Nothing in this project is going to be a secret. We've told you everything we know about the drugs before you take them, and we'll tell you everything we need to know about you after you finish your sessions. That sounded like a good deal to them. In the following week, each prisoner was administered a long and complicated battery of psychological tests. And it happened that on March 27, 1961, in the large ward room in the prison infirmary in Concord, Massachusetts, 5 prisoners and the 3 Harvard psychologists met for a trip. In the morning, I was to turn on with 3 convicts and the 2 other students. Fuck's sake, man. I am dyslexic. And the 2 other prisoners and the 2 graduate students would act as observers. Then in the afternoon, Gunther Well and Ralph Metzner and the 2 observing prisoners were to take the drug, and the rest of us were to act as guides. We brought a record player, tape recorder, and some books of classical art with us. Otherwise, the room was bleak in decor with 4 beds, a large table, and a few chairs. At 9:35 in the morning, the bowl of pills was placed in the center of the table. I was the first one to turn on in the prison project. I reached over, took 40 milligrams of psilocybin, then I handed the bowl to the prisoner next to me. And he took 20 milligrams and then passed on to the guy next to him who took 20 and the next man. And then we pushed the bowl to the middle of the table and sat back to see what would happen. I'll never forget that morning. Oh, this is going to be interesting. After about half an hour, I could feel the effect coming up, the loosening of symbolic reality, the feeling of humming pressure and space voyage inside my head, the sharp, brilliant, brutal intensification of all the senses. Every cell and every sense organ was humming with charged electricity. I felt terrible. What a place to be on a grey morning in a dingy room with a grim penitentiary out of my mind. I looked over at the man next to me, a Polish embezzler for Worcester, Massachusetts. I could see him so clearly. I could see every pore in his face, every blemish, the hairs in his nose, the incredible green-yellowish enamel of the decay in his teeth, the wet glistening of his frightened eyes. I could see every hair in his head as though each was as big as an oak tree. What a confrontation. What am I doing here? Out of my mind with this strange mosaic-celled animal prisoner criminal. I said to him with a weak grin, "How are you doing, John?" He said, "I feel fine." He then paused for a minute and asked, "How are you doing, Doc?" Damn. I was about to say in a reassuring psychological tone that I felt fine, but I couldn't. So I said, I feel lousy. John drew back his purple-pink lips, showed his green-yellow teeth in a sickly grin and said, "What's the matter, Doc? Why you feel lousy?" I looked with my 2 microscopic retina lenses into his eyes. I could see every line, yellow spider webs, red networks of veins gleaming at me. I said, "John, I'm afraid of you." His eyes got bigger, and then he began to laugh. I could look into his mouth, swollen red tissues, gums, tongue, throat. I was about prepared to be swallowed. Then I heard him say, "Well, that's funny, Doc, because I'm afraid of you." Damn. What a turnaround, huh? We were both smiling at this point, leaning forward. Doc, he said, "Why are you afraid of me?" I said, "I'm afraid of you, John, because you're a criminal." He nodded. I said, "John, why are you afraid of me?" He said, "I'm afraid of you, Doc, because you're a mad scientist." Then our retinas locked and I slid down into the tunnel of his eyes and I could feel him walking around in my skull and we both began to laugh. And there it was, that dark moment of fear and distrust which could have changed in a second to become hatred and terror, but we made the love connection. The flicker in the dark, suddenly the sun came out in the room and I felt great and I knew he did too. Oh, that's lovely. And more I Ching. Fire below and the lake above combat and destroy each other. So too, in the course of the year, a combat takes place between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, eventuating in the revolution of the seasons. Man masters these changes in nature by noting their regularity and marking off the passage of time accordingly. In this way, order and clarity appear in the apparently chaotic change of the seasons, and man is able to adjust himself in advance to the demands of the different times. I think there's going to be some kind of theme about changing seasons here soon. We'll have to find out. We had passed that moment of crisis, but as the minutes slowly ticked on, the grimness of our situation... Oh, he's in prison. Yeah, Leary was in prison at one point, actually. Yeah, Asian. Kept coming back in microscopic clarity. There were the 4 of us, turned on, every sense vibrating, pulsating with messages, 2 billion years of cellular wisdom. But what could we do trapped within the 4 walls of a grey hospital room, barred inside a maximum security prison? Then one of the great lessons in my psychedelic training took place. One of the turn-on prisoners was a Negro from Texas, jazz saxophone player, heroin addict. He looked around with 2 huge balls of ocular white, shook his head, staggered over the record player, put on a record. It was a Sonny Rollins record, which he especially asked us to bring. Then he lay down on the cot and closed his eyes. The rest of us sat by the table while metal air from the yellow saxophone spinning across copper electric wires bounced off the walls to the room. There was a long silence. There we heard Willie moaning softly and moving restlessly on the couch. I turned and looked at him and said, "Willie, are you all right?" There was an apprehension in my voice. Everyone in the room swung his head anxiously to look and listen for the answer. Willie lifted his head and gave a big grin and said, "Man, am I all right? I'm in heaven and I can't believe it." This is such a heartwarming thing, man. Here I am in heaven, man, and I'm stoned out of my mind. And I'm swinging like I've never been before, and it's all happening in prison. And you ask me, man, am I all right? What a laugh. And then he laughed, and we were all laughed, and suddenly we were all high and happy and chuckling at what we had done, bringing music and love and beauty and serenity and fun and the seed of life into that grim and dreary prison. What, man? That's actually one of the most heartwarming things I've ever heard from the story so far. So that's good. Well, the session went on and on. There were high points and low points, ecstasies and terrors. My friend John, the Polishman, got sick and vomited. We all got pretty thoughtful. Why are there prisons? Why do some men put the warm cellular envelopes of their fellow men in metal cages? What were we doing here? Then after a few hours, Ralph and Gunther and the 2 remaining convicts turned on. Gunther was silly and acting like a hipster, and Ralph fell down on the bed and experienced visions of Blakean terror. 2 prisoners came and held his hand and guided him through. Dr. Presnell would check him in every now and then, walk around the room like a dainty, graceful cat, not saying much but taking it all in. And the guards came in, bringing metal trays of food, which we all looked at with disbelief. The way you look at the plate of worms on a pot of sawdust served up to you on a plate, and someone said, "Man, do they call that food?" Since we Harvard people weren't allowed to eat prison food at the expense of the state, Dr. Pressel went out and got milkshakes and sandwiches, which we all shared, and we had never tasted food so good. Then, at 5 o'clock, there was a bang on the door, and we opened it up, and the guards came in and said, "Time is up, man. Back to the prison ward." Ralph Gunther and I went with the 5 prisoners back to the lockup part of the hospital and sat there on beds and smoked and laughed, and compared notes of what we'd seen and where we'd been. And then it was time for us to go. We shook hands, said we'd be back tomorrow. And then Ralph and Gunther and I walked out of the prison. Across the dark yard, rang the bell, and waited until the iron doors opened into the guard room. And then across the guard room, through the 2 metal doors and down the metal stairs, past the clanking, steaming, old-fashioned radiators. And then we were outside. Ralph and Gunther got into their car and drove back to Cambridge, and I got into my car and drove to Newton. As I rode along the highway, the tension and the drama of the day suddenly snapped off, and I could look back and see what we had done. Nothing you see is secret in a prison, and the 8 of us who had assembled to take drugs together in a prison were under the microscopic gaze of every convict in the prison, every guard, and within hours the world... Oh my God, man. The word would have fanned through the invisible network to every other prison in the state. Grim Walpole Penitentiary, Grey Sullen Walled, Norfolk. Did you hear? Some Harvard professor gave us a new drug to some guys at Concord. They had a ball. It was great. It was great. It's a grand thing. It's something new. Hope. Maybe hope. Perhaps something new. We sure need some new hope. This is... How warming is that, man? Revolution. On your own day you are believed. Supreme success. Further through perseverance, remorse disappears. So is that... Wow. Okay, that's the 9th trip. You know, thanks for coming in for whoever wanted to watch. I didn't expect this one to be so quick, actually. And it's sort of interesting because I was hoping that it wasn't too long, and it wasn't. So I'm actually really glad that it actually did happen that way. So thank you all for tuning in to Yours Truly Baphomet. Please like, share, subscribe, press the bell notification, subscribe to me on Substack. And I will see you guys later. See you later.